Hello, hello. Hi. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Bob.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good, thanks. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm gonna turn you down a little bit.
All right.
Great. Thanks for doing this.
Of course. Hi, Meg.
Oh, wow. We're in a proper lecture hall.
You are. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is a regular classroom, and there are even our students here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Hi, Bob. It's lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So thank you for doing this virtually.
Of course.
Not a problem. Happy to.
Will you have anything to share on the screen, or you?
Yes.
So I'll make you both co-hosts.
All right.
And I have some slides as well, Bob.
Great. Okay, so you'll both be co-hosts. Good. Okay, so why don't we begin since we're here and you've been waiting patiently. Anyone have any questions for me before we start? Okay, so tonight, usually in this class, we visit the Boston Public Library at Copley Square, which is one of the great resources in all of America. And we're really fortunate to be in the same city with it and have this great institution, which unfortunately is, I believe it's closed right now. However, we have Chris Glass and Meghan Weeks from the library. Usually Chris gives us a tour of the library, introduces us to it, and he's going to do that virtually tonight. He and Meghan will be telling us more about the Boston Public Library. Who's been to the Copley Square Library? For the record, one hand is up, and so we'll find out more about it, how you can use it, what you'll find there. So welcome, Chris Glass and Meghan Weeks.
Thank you so much, Bob, and hi to all of you. How many students roughly are actually on site right now?
There are 5 in the class and then 3 online, and I expect more will be trickling in one way or another. We have 19 enrolled in the class. And so this is also being recorded, so then it will be up on the class site. So those who aren't here will still be able to benefit from it.
Wonderful. Well, that would be perfect because we could fit you all in the virtual vestibule with us. So we'll imagine we're there right now providing an introduction. So I'm happy to start off introducing myself, and maybe Chris, you want to introduce yourself as well, to giving a sense of our positions, and then the way we've planned today is to essentially divide up the initial hour into halves, and I'll give an overview of the built heritage and institutional history, and then the art and architecture tour, at least in so much as we can provide it virtually, and Chris will address library services. So as I said, Bob said, I'm Meghan Weeks, and I'm the Curator of Interpretation in the Special Collections Department. Chris?
I'm Chris Glass. I'm a Research Services Librarian in the Research Services Department. That's the main reference department.
And we're so excited to be here with you today, albeit virtually. So I'll plan on sharing my screen. And if I can do so, I think I've been made a co-host. This is like the phrase of, let's see, the phrase of 2020 and 2021. Can you see my screen? Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Bob, oh, there, great. All right. So the challenge of providing you all with a art and architecture tour virtually is that a lot of what we talk about on site at the Central Library in Copley Square is very contingent on the physical spaces. And we really benefit from being able to get what we call a haptic sense of these rooms, both in terms of the ceiling height, the way that your voices reverberate off of the walls, the materials that surround us, the light quality. So we're not going to get that today through a slideshow, which is why I want to extend the invitation to all of you, not only to visit us when we're open to the public for general visitation, as Chris will mention, we're open for some limited in-person services currently, but also to come on an art and architecture tour. In normal times, we offer these at least once a day for the public for walk-in tours. And then we're always happy to do private tours for groups of friends or organizations or classes. So I hope you'll come and see this in person. I know there's one of you that raised your hand who's had a previous visit. So today we'll be taking you through this palace for the people and trying to give you the best sense of it that we can, at least in half an hour in the virtual world. So before I start, and this is where I invite you guys to jump in on chat or even to unmute yourselves, and just tell me what you think might be something about the BPL's founding that makes this institution so important. This is sort of a quiz that we offer to a lot of our art and architecture groups coming in. Any guesses? Is this where I get to jump in and do that anyone Bueller comment? So unless you're willing to jump in right now, I'll spoil the quiz and say that we're typically trying to pick out this idea that we are the first and oldest municipally founded free public library in the United States. We're actually also the third largest, if you count NYPL, which is both public and private, in terms of collections holdings behind NYPL and the Library of Congress. We're beat out slightly by the small public library in Peterborough, New Hampshire, founded in 1883 or 1833, but we actually signed our first charter in 1848. The Board of Trustees convened in 1852 for the first time, and that is our official founding date. We opened our first doors in a 2-room schoolhouse on Mason Street. Now, Bob, you can tell me if Garrett Nelson, the curator of the Map Center, I believe already addressed this class this year, is that right?
Yes.
And Garrett probably introduced you to this wonderful program that he and his team developed called Atlas Scope. And Atlas Scope is a tool we use very frequently. I can't recommend it highly enough for seeing previous building sites, and in some cases, previous building owners. In this 2-room schoolhouse on Mason Street, which was our first central library location, was just on the east side of Boston Common. And you can see this from, I think, roughly 1856 or so. We very quickly outgrew that space. There was a huge demand for a public library in the city of Boston, mainly because the existing libraries were subscription libraries or connected to colleges and universities. So Harvard College, for instance, the Athenaeum, these were not libraries that were open and accessible to all. And there was a real goal on the part of the city to develop an institution that would offer that continued education to the entire citizenry of Boston. There was a great demand for it. We outgrew that 2-room schoolhouse, no surprises there, and moved into our first purpose-built library location in 1858. And this was on Boylston Street, just a bit farther down from our current location. This is on the current site of the Emerson College Colonial Theater, for reference. And again, looking at Atlas Scope, you can see the south side of Boston Common. This is an 1870 overlay map showing the second central library location. This is a view of the original Bates Hall reading room in that space. You can see that these were well-used spaces. There quickly became apparent some issues with circulation, with heat control. Apparently it was a very stuffy space. Overcrowding. There were also some complaints that patrons would just come in and gawk at the artwork, which you can see from these sculptures, which was already starting to fill our reading rooms and spaces. We, in special collections, and I can talk more at length about that if it's helpful, collect everything from rare books and manuscripts to prints, drawings, ephemera, paintings, sculpture, and you can just start to see some of these special collections on display, which I just find funny that some patrons took issue with the fact that there were, young couples canoodling while looking at sculptures and paintings. And this is a space that became quickly overcrowded. The original Boylston Street building had a couple cool features in terms of library services, which I know Chris is going to delve into when he talks about what's available to all of you current library patrons. And one of which was the indicator. And I love to show this in presentations about our built history because it's a cool device that had these little pegs, one in black, one in white, and librarians could flip the pegs to show which books were available and which had been taken out. So this was a way of indicating what books would be on the shelves and available to patrons for circulation or in library use. So 1858 moved into that new location. It was a matter of less than 3 decades before we realized that we needed yet more space for the central library in the city of Boston. And the city, fortunately, was expanding in size. Now, some of you might be familiar with Shawmut Peninsula, the original landmass of Boston, which was then expanded through the Back Bay infill project. This is a view from 1840 showing Back Bay, or this brackish backwater of the Charles River, before it was created as a landmass, which would later house and now houses the Back Bay neighborhood and the current Central Library in Copley Square. So our current location in Copley Square, this is an overlay view before the Mckim building as we now know it, and the Johnson building was constructed. The city was given this parcel of land bounded by Dartmouth Street, Boylston Street, Blagden Street on the south side, and Exeter Street for the purpose of building a central library. But there was a catch. We had to break ground by a certain date. And in the time-honored tradition of bureaucratic government institutions, we took a little bit longer than one might desire to select an architect. So there was a competition issued, number of false starts, and we went through $10,000 of prize money awarding firms who had submitted designs with prizes, none of which ended up being the design selected for the Central Library. In order to break ground and to secure this gift of land from the city, or this allocation of land, we had to move forward with an architect who was not our first pick. And that architect was a man named Arthur Banal, the city architect. And sure enough, we spent, I think, something to the tune of $74,000, which was a lot in 1887, I think, at this point, developing foundations for a building that were ultimately raised and then changed. So false starts before we finally selected the architect of choice, Charles Fallon Mckim of the New York-based firm Mckim, Mead and White. And this is Mr. Charles Fallon Mckim, pictured at center here. The trustees were given the authority to finally select the architect they really wanted, and that was indeed Mr. Mckim from this New York-based firm. And Charles Fallon Mckim designed what we now know as the Mckim building, his namesake building, at the Central Library in Copley Square. So this, if you look at this image from around the turn of the 20th century, it hasn't changed much. We've done a bit of work on the cornice of the building, but for the most part, it's very much today what it looked like in the early 20th century and late 19th. So Copley Square, a little bit more history about this particular location, this landmark space in the city. This was formerly known as Art Square because its center here in this image from the turn of the century, we see the original location of the Museum of Fine Arts. To the left, Trinity Church, currently standing, which is on the east side of Copley Square. So the old MFA was on the site of the current Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel, which was constructed in 1912. The MFA moved down the street to its current location in 1909. And then we see the BPL Mckim building here facing the Copley Square on the west side, and then Old South Church. So a closer look at, some of these buildings. This is the original MFA, again, very much a Gothic revivalist style. Trinity Church, this was designed by H.H. Richardson, an architect that was actually Charles Fallon Mckim's mentor. And this was rendered in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. And then Old South Church, very, very different from the style that Mckim ultimately chose for the Mckim building. And he wanted it to be different. He thought a broad facade would be more effective against these buildings that had a sense of warmth and ascension. And people weren't wild about it initially. It was criticized. Some of the early architectural reviews called it a matchbox. Some called it a morgue. But Mckim was very intentional in the design of his facade. And we'll get into that in just a minute because it made reference to some great buildings of reference. So the 1888 Cornerstone laying ceremony was met with a lot of fanfare. There was a poem read by the Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who in that poem declared that this palace would be the people's own. And that's where the terminology palace for the people that we often use when describing this building came about. This was to be a building that would elevate patrons. It would be free to all. It would be chock-a-block with art and architecture, some of the greatest examples of painting and sculpture and design available in the day, and this would be open to everybody. So it's a real tribute to the city when we think about creating this palace for everybody, open and free to all. The construction of the building, you can see it starting to come up from the ground up on those false start foundations. If you look at the upper right of this image, we see Rafael Guastavino, who is not exactly a household name, but he was a Spanish builder who had immigrated to the States in 1881. And he brought with him master skill in designing these tile vault ceilings. You can see him standing on one of these arches here, the supports of the ceiling. And he approached Mckim, having had no major commissions in the United States previously, and said, I can offer you a program of ceilings that is lightweight, strong, incredibly strong. You can see, well, Guastavino at least load testing, but most importantly, fireproof. And that was a huge selling point in the 1880s, where there had been so many devastating urban fires. So for a library to contain lots of people, books, marble, to have not only strong ceilings, light ceilings, but fireproof ceilings, Guastavino was the perfect collaborator, and Mckim brought him onto the project to design a lot of the ceiling programs throughout the building. This is an early shot of the construction, where you can see that they were testing out the height of the facade and the cornice to get a sense of the proportionality on Copley Square. And then I love this. We have a wonderful collection of images on digital Commonwealth of the Mckim building's construction, but this is the one that kind of haunts me. This image of a gentleman standing in his bowler hat in what would become the balconies and the doorways of the special libraries floor on the 3rd floor of the Mckim building. So in designing the facade, we mentioned Mckim received some criticism for his matchbox/morgue against Trinity Church and the Museum of Fine Arts and Old South Church, these very different buildings surrounding Art Square. But he was really looking to some historic precedents, including one very notable library designed by Le Proust in 1850 in Paris. This is the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. You can see some similarities in the fenestration and the proportionality of the facade. Mckim also looked to the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini by Alberti, and to the Marshall Field Wholesale store in Chicago, designed by, again, his mentor, H.H. Richardson, architect of Trinity Church. And yet there are a few details about our facade that make the BPL's building very much distinctly Bostonian, shall we say. There are a lot of dolphins throughout the building, incidentally, paying homage to our maritime history, and the green cornice or green copper cornice on the facade is no exception. So we have this alternating pattern of dolphins and seashells and a number of very expressive lions below. And then dropping our eyes downward to the facade, these details, these medallions designed by Domingo Mora are actually product placement, if you will. They're designs and logos of some of the greatest bookbinders and graphic designers of the day. And then following the view downward to the facade we see on the lower portion here. Unfortunately, when we had these photographs taken, there was only one of the 5 flags up. It looks a little bit lonely in this photograph, but nevertheless, there's some beautiful photographs shot on a really sunny day earlier last year. We have these 3 seals by Augustus St. Gaudens, the seal of Massachusetts at left, the seal of the library at center, and the seal of the city at right. And when the seal at center, which was designed by Kenyon Cox, which was the seal of the library, when this was unveiled, people absolutely freaked out. So the construction in the Mckim building between 1888 and 1895 was really hitting in the prime of this sort of, shall we say, puritanical Boston attitude. And when people saw these 2 nude boys flanking a book, they absolutely freaked out, for lack of better description. And they said there are only 2 solutions to this. One involves chisels and the other involves leaves. Unfortunately for the boys, neither were pursued, and they were allowed to continue to grace the front of our building. Below the seals, we have, of course, our main motto, free to all. And then below that, the head of Minerva, goddess of wisdom in the hunt, also sculpted by Domingo Mora and Augustus St. Gaudens. Now, this is a view of the entire facade. And this is, I should say, you can still visit this while the library isn't open to general visitation and appreciate these 2 sculptures on either side, art and science. This is a close-up of art, honoring some great artists of note and holding a palette and a brush. And both of these were sculpted by Bella Pratt, who was a student at the Museum of Fine Arts just across the way. So let's head inside. The vestibule as we enter the building is an example of Mckim using a range of materials, from this beautiful pink Knoxville marble on the walls to gray Istrian and Georgian and Tennessee marble on the floors, to really create a great sense of color and patterning and composition throughout the spaces. At the far end of the vestibule, we have a sculpture of Sir Henry Vane by a man named Frederick McManus. And Henry Vane was the 6th and at that point, the youngest yet governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who had actually made himself known to be very outspoken against the crown, very much in support of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And unfortunately for Harry Vane, he made the decision to go back to England on some state business and found himself swiftly beheaded for treason against the king, I believe in 1662. We also have these bronze doors, 6 in total. I'm showing 2 pairs of them now, sculpted by Daniel Chester French. Each one of these weighs 1,500 pounds, and yet they're incredibly thin relief structures showing these beautiful allegorical figures. So it's a form called BAS or BAS relief, a way of rendering a great sense of depth with a very, very shallow relief. Daniel Chester French is perhaps better known for the Minuteman sculpture in Concord, Massachusetts, something you can visit now in COVID times, and the seated Lincoln Memorial. And this is Daniel Chester French posing next to a maquette of that larger Lincoln Memorial that is now on site in Washington, DC. As we step into the lobby, this is from one of the original albums of the building when it first opened in 1895. Some of the most striking characteristics are these beautiful barrel vault ceilings. These ceilings and bay vaults were also designed by Raphael Guastavino. And the marble flooring with beautiful brass inlay designs. These have all been repoured since the originals. But here again, we have the seal of the library, more boys, more dolphins. And as I mentioned, Raphael Guastavino played a key role in designing the lobby ceilings, and they are just a wonderful example of his variety of vaulting, but also an example of Guastavino collaborating with local Italian immigrant craftsmen who created these mosaic tile vault designs, bearing the names of some great Massachusetts-born statesmen, from John Singleton Copley to, in this case, John Adams, the nation's 2nd president. We include him here because it's a nice nod to our special collections holdings. We actually have John Adams' personal library in our rare books and manuscripts collection. As we walk up the grand staircase, this is what it looks like on a regular art and architecture tour. You'll see this beautiful yellow sienna marble surrounding us. Mckim actually quarried 10 times the amount of marble needed so that he could choose his pick for this particular staircase. And he selected it because it has this beautiful gold undertone in this patterning of kind of a russet red and black, which draws your eye upwards. On the landing, we meet these 2 lion sculptures. These are actually war memorials to the 2 Massachusetts volunteer infantries that were hardest hit by casualties in the American Civil War, the 2nd Infantry and the 20th. And we ask folks what they're sculpted out of, if they can take any guesses. You can drop a guess in the chat, but I'm going to spoil it by saying it's the same yellow sienna marble that surrounds the staircase, but they were delivered unpolished. So Louis St. Gaudens, brother of Augustus St. Gaudens, who we mentioned previously, was a bit of a procrastinator, and he didn't quite finish before he needed to deliver them to the library. And initially, Mckim and the trustees thought, this will not do. These stick out like sore thumbs. You have to polish them once they arrive on site. But fortunately for the lions, and I think for the composition of the space, the polishing was never pursued, although we've told patrons for 125 years that it's good luck to rub the tails. And you can see, if you look at their tails, there's been a bit of collaborative polishing, which reveals their yellow sienna marble tones. As we go up to the 2nd floor, the Pube de Chavan gallery is the first of 3 major mural cycles surrounding us. And Pube de Chavan was the most highly regarded muralist of the 19th century in Europe. And he was 72 years old at the time of accepting the commission, reticent to travel to Boston from Paris, where he had made his home. And so he said, I will do this project for a hefty sum. I will also do it only if you send me a sample of the yellow sienna marble so I can key my palette appropriately and proper measurements of the space. So all of the niches surrounding the staircase and this broad wall, you can see what they look like previous to the installation and then in current day after them. The remarkable thing is that Pube never saw these murals installed. He painted them entirely in Paris. had them rolled up, shipped to Boston, and then essentially wallpapered. It's actually a French term called mariflage, which uses lead white paint and linseed oil to bind this Belgian linen to the walls. So they look very much like frescoes. They are painted in a very muted palette. A lot of people who come in just assume they're painted directly into the plaster, but they are sure enough Belgian linen that's been mariflaged onto the walls. And we did a pretty hefty conservation project on this panel, philosophy panel, which is one of the 8 allegorical panels surrounding the staircase, because it started to fall off due to some moisture infiltration. So there's a YouTube video on that if you guys want to dig around for it. It was a really scary but really fascinating project all the same. So as I mentioned, allegorical subjects surround the staircase, giving some advertisements for what you might learn about in the library. We just showed you the philosophy panel. We also have the astronomy panel with Chaldean shepherds regarding the stars. The history panel with a red-robed spirit or red-robed figure calling up spirits from the past, stories from the past. And I should say I'm only going over 3 of those. There are 8 in total, but there's this huge panel we saw in development in Pube studio, adjacent to the entrance to Bates Hall, our reading room. And this actually contains more allegorical figures, including one of study, holding a tablet, contemplation, at right with her hand to her head in thought, and then enlightenment above the doorway, who, according to legend, started off his life unclothed and was summarily covered with a swath of fabric when Pube was informed that these panels were going to Boston and that they were not keen on nudity and it wasn't appropriate. So there was a bit of public intervention in enlightenment. But we ask folks if they can identify a type of technology that was contemporary to 1895, 1896 when these were painted, but wouldn't have existed in classical times. And sure enough, a lot of patrons look at study and say, oh, she's holding a tablet or an iPad, or contemplation and say, oh, she's holding a cell phone. Not quite. What we're trying to get at is the physics panel on the other side of the staircase, which has a nod to the latest technology of the day. And that was the invention of the telegraph. So a telegraph wire with 2 allegorical figures using physics or science to harness the power of electricity and communicate over the telegraph wire. So we have good news at top and bad news at the bottom, traveling over the wire. As we head into Bates Hall, this is our main reading room. We looked at the previous iteration of Bates Hall in the other Boylston Street building. This was named after our first major benefactor, this gentleman in a sculpture here, Joshua Bates, who gave the first major donation to the library, a sum in total of $100,000, which is about $1.3 million in today's funds, for the donation or for the purchase of books. Now, Bates gave this donation with a few stipulations: that the library be warm and well lighted, which we were from the very beginning, that it be an ornament to the city, and that it, most importantly, be free to all. And with all of those stipulations met, as well as its ability to hold at least 150 people. We accepted the donation, and we've named our main reading room after him ever since. So Bates Hall is probably the most Instagram space in the entire building. And it has this beautiful barrel vault ceiling, not designed by Raphael Guastavino. We can see it in its early days, right at the turn of the century, and how crowded the original oak tables were, how crowded they were pre-COVID. And these signature green lamps, which are actually reproductions of the originals. And these bookshelves, all original to 1895. The Abbey Room, which I think Chris had mentioned that you took a particular shine to the Abbey Room, is that right?
Yes, yes.
And I'm happy to go through the panels that make this room so special. But the Abbey Room was the original book delivery room. This is adjacent to Bates Hall. This is where patrons would await the books that they had requested in Bates Hall. And those book requests would be sent into an adjacent space just off view, which was known as the tube room. And there was a system of pneumatic tubes that would actually funnel the requests up and down the stacks so that patrons could retrieve their requested item. An early postcard showing a highly colorized version of the space and what it looks like to be on a live art and architecture tour. So you guys can just picture yourself it's a little bit uncomfortable to think of yourself being closer than 6 feet away from humans right now, but that's what it looks in normal times. And it's beautiful coffered ceilings, which are designed after the ceilings of the Doge's Palace in Venice. But the most important, I should say, the most notable feature of the room arguably is this mural cycle by Edwin Austin Abbey, who was at the time not the most likely pick for a mural painter at the Central Library. He had done very little work in oil paint, very little of note, I should say, and no murals, which is extraordinary to think that this was his first major effort. He was, however, a very well-known illustrator for Harper's Magazine, and he knew how to essentially tell a story through illustration. So he was a good pick to tell a story around a room that would entertain patrons while they waited for their books. This is Edwin Austin Abbey painting in his studio in Morgan Hall in Fairfordshire, Gloucestershire, in England, a studio that was actually the largest of its kind in England at the time, and a studio that he shared with his friend John Singer Sargent. So Edwin Austin Abbey filled the space with a 15-panel mural cycle showing the story of Sir Galahad and his quest for the Holy Grail. So I'll go through this extremely quickly. 15 panels where Galahad, the infant Galahad, is presented with the Grail from on high, an angel telling him that he must live a perfect life and achieve his quest in order to become the ideal knight. Galahad in the second panel is outfitted, I should mention, is always pictured in red from panel 2 to 15, so that he's easy to identify, outfitted with his spurs by Sir Lancelot and Sir Bors. In the third panel, he approaches King Arthur's round table. The only catch is that there's only one seat left at the table, and that seat happens to be this little red swath stool. That seat was known as the seat perilous, and it had been essentially bewitched, so that anybody who took that seat who was not pure of heart would die instantly. And it previously had not gone well for anybody attempting it. And if you look at the left side of this panel, you'll see the other knights clamoring, no, don't do this. It never ends well. And yet Galahad, the young and pure aspiring knight, says, I can do this. I've committed no sin, no harm. He takes the seat and he survives, which is why there are another 12 panels to talk about. In the fourth panel, Galahad, pictured at the front of the knights here, and the knights receive a briefing to undertake their first task, which is to free, this is the fifth panel that fills an entire wall of the room, to free the castle of King Amfortas, the Fisher King, from a curse that had befallen them. All of them had been rendered spiritually dead, and Galahad, shown to the left of the doorway lintel here, actually fails that first test because he looks inward. He looks to himself to try to solve this problem and break this curse, rather than looking to those more experienced than he. So there's a bit of naivete coming into the story. Abbey here renders Sir Galahad kneeling and contemplating his quest, and then fighting off the 7 knights of darkness, the 7 deadly sins, to receive the keys to reach the Castle of Maidens. And the Castle of Maidens is the portion of the castle where the lovely ladies reside. I can't look at this scene without thinking about a scene from The Bachelor, because that's the way my brain functions these days. It's essentially Sir Galahad receiving the affections of dozens of women who all want to marry him. But the thing I love about this panel is that Edwin Austin Abbey had every one of these costumes commissioned by a costume maker. And the model for most of these ladies was actually this man, Antonio Corsi, who was the Zoolander of his day, the go-to male model for artists. So to think that most of these ladies were in fact Antonio is just, it's really funny and wonderful. Moving on, Galahad selects Blanchefleur to be his wife and realizes, unfortunately, on their wedding night that he cannot consummate the marriage and remain a pure or virgin knight. So he must leave her and continue on his quest. Here he frees King Amfortas, the Fisher King, allowing him to become mortal and die and ascend into heaven. And then we see Galahad riding forth on his mighty white steed, leaving the land. This was such a beloved mural cycle in the early 20th century by Bostonians and Americans, full stop, that this was actually made into a postage stamp. I can't stress how many reproductions were made of this mural cycle, how frequently it was used in classrooms to educate students on the story of the Grail and on this wonderful public art installation. Galahad, as I mentioned, leaves the land, crosses the Sea of Solomon on a ship to reach the city of Sarras, this very thin elevation, where he becomes king. In the final panel, Galahad builds a golden tree. And you can see every one of these tendrils and sprigs represents one of the young knight's accomplishments. And at this point, he sees the Grail, the Holy Grail. And the Grail itself, as the legend goes, could not be seen by man. Man could not survive on Earth having seen the Grail. So Galahad then drops his crown and his sword and ascends into heaven, not to be seen again with the Grail until Monty Python comes into play. But the interesting thing about this panel is that it's rendered in what we call raised relief, which is plaster or wood, anything proud of that oil painted mural surface. These again were mariflush onto the wall, painted in England, shipped over. But this raised relief is really integral to the illumination of these panels. And we think this may have been a technique that was actually used or learned, that Abbey learned from his studio mate, John Singer Sargent. So the last, second to last stop on our tour, and I know I'm just sneaking over 30 minutes here, so I will wrap up very soon, is this wonderful, wonderful feature of the building, my favorite room in the entire million square foot structure, the Sargent Gallery, which is on the 3rd floor up a long staircase. This is a mural cycle I'm not going to do justice to today on a very brief tour, but this took 29 years of John Singer Sargent's career to design. Most of the artists who contributed to this building were given free rein in terms of their subject choice. Sargent was no exception. He initially thought maybe he would do a subject from Spanish literature. Abbey had done a great story from Western literature, multiple versions of the Grail legend. Sargent thought maybe I'll show Don Quixote. And yet that wasn't a big enough topic for him. He at this point had established himself as a portrait painter, but wanted to prove himself by doing something more. And so he chose the theme, the triumph of religion, which was a bit of a contentious topic in a public secular building. And as I said, I won't do due credit to that today, but suffice to say, 29 years, painted entirely in England, brought over in 4 shipments and installed in 4 phases in 1895, 1903, 1916, and 1919. And the first installation is something of note. This is on the north end of the gallery, showing the pagan gods. It just gives you a sense of, again, filling these spaces in these incredibly progressive installations. This is John Singer Sargent working on this particular arc that we just viewed in situ in his studio in London. And I love this image because it shows the process of actually thinking about how this panel would fit into the physical space. This is a 3rd scale model that Sargent had constructed so that he could test different lighting conditions and raised relief elements out in the space. This was always intended to be viewed in natural light. And we mentioned raised relief in relation to Abbey. Sargent had over 600 different pieces of raised relief integrated into this mural cycle, including metal and glass. This is on a start, the blue robe goddess, pagan goddess, and more, gilded wings, gilded wood, plaster, leather. It is just, it's extraordinary. The frieze of prophets that butts this pagan god section has an image of Moses, and this is a particularly proud section of relief as well. And then Sargent's wheelhouse, for those of you that know John Singer Sargent, you'll know him as mostly a portrait painter. His wheelhouse was these highly representational images of figures. Most of the models for these were actually people that he came across and approached on the street through travels in Northern Africa and the Middle East. There are preparatory watercolors in the MFA for just these same figures. But one of my favorite inclusions, we mentioned that man, Antonio Corsi, the model for Edwin Austin Abbey. While the 2 artists shared a studio, they also shared a model, and Edwin Austin Abbey couldn't be held out. He was the model for Hosea, one of the prophets pictured in the Frieze of Prophets. The south end of the gallery, 1903, we have Sargent making a nod to Christianity with the Holy Trinity, Christ on the cross, and the Frieze of Angels. And then he filled the remaining walls with smaller lunettes. So we have heaven, judgment, and hell. Those are 3 of the lunettes on the west wall. And you can see that each of these lunettes is well integrated into the architecture of the space as well. So this beautiful ornament was designed and in some cases carved by Sargent himself. A painter really, really going, beyond the call to create this masterpiece, this masterwork. The final installation in 1919 was actually not the last intended. Sargent installed an image on this east wall of church and synagogue. And this is where the controversy really came into play, as I mentioned, religion being such a personal topic. It was a challenging topic to show in a public secular building, and people within and well beyond the Jewish community took understandable issue with this image of synagogue as a collapsing figure, in contrast to church, who by contrast is relatively stable. And Sargent was broadly criticized, thought to be making a statement on, Judaism versus Christianity. There was a petition issued and brought to the State House level in the early 1920s to have the murals taken down. And the petition actually failed in court because the funding for these particular panels was private and not public. And yet that outcry continued. A patron came in and splashed a vial of ink against synagogue, and Sargent had to return to clean it himself. So in large part because of the controversy around the synagogue panel, but also because he was consumed with other mural commissions at the Museum of Fine Arts. He actually did 2 panels at the Widener Library at Harvard as well. And he lost his niece, Rosemarie Ormond, in a bombing of a church in Paris in the Great War. These, as I mentioned, installed in 1919, were being painted as Sargent was writing to the library saying, "The Zeppelins are coming. I have to get them out of London." He never got to the final panel. And so the mural cycle remains incomplete, but I encourage you to see it anytime you want to spend 3 days in the Sargent Gallery. I'd be happy to talk about it. So lastly, we have the courtyard of the Mckim building, a wonderful space to come in and enjoy a moment of fresh air and quiet within the city. We host concerts here in normal times, twice a week in the summer. And the courtyard itself was designed, this is a view of the Palazzo di Cancelleria in Rome, which was the primary architectural reference for the courtyard in Mckim. You can see the beautiful alleys around the courtyard, views of the city, and in fact, modern, quite modern architecture compared to the Mckim building around it. And we have this wonderful sculpture of Bacchante, an infant faun, designed by Frederick McMonnies, who did Henry Vane in the vestibule. Now, coming back to this theme of puritanical Boston, when she was unveiled, people completely freaked out. This was a gift by Charles Follen Mckim to the library, perhaps thanking them for the commission. And people looked at it and they said, "She's awful. She's drinking. She has a clasp of grapes in her arm. She's dancing. She's completely inebriated. And worst yet, she's subjecting this infant faun, this baby, to this horrible debauched behavior." This was like Michael Jackson dangling blanket over the balcony. This was an abomination. And so they called for her to be taken down. Mckim said, "Fine, I'm going to donate her to a city who can handle her." And so he gave that same sculpture to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she's pictured here. Every time I go, I snap a picture and shake my head. Fortunately, our friends at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston had made a copy of the original. She became very popularized because of the controversy at BPL. They allowed us to make a copy of the copy. So this is Bacchante 3. She's back on site. You can see her a bit covered in snow here in this image. And my favorite juxtaposition in the whole building is this gentleman who is on the west side of the courtyard, a bust of Francis Walker. He was the person who led the charge for her to get taken down. He now gets to stare at her for the rest of time. So zooming across the Johnson building, and I don't want to jump into this, Chris is going to talk about library services here. We have our 1972 edition, which was built just adjacent to Mckim on a different foundation type. It's actually architecturally suspended from its upper levels. It has an interior courtyard, Di Ferrari Hall, named after another great benefactor, John D. Ferrari, from the mid-20th century. And this is how it looked in the 70s. Thankfully, we renovated the Johnson building in 2012 to 2016 and now have it filled with light and air and space. The new and novel selection allows patrons to browse new releases. And I'm not going to steal Chris's thunder by going into it too much. Tech Central, where patrons can access computers, and then the upper levels mimicking the lamps, the green lamps from Bates Hall. Regular story hours in the children's room. And then on special collections, a quick nod to our exhibition work as well. We also work to bring our special collections out to the public when possible. It's been a while since we've done a major exhibition because of a number of inventories, but this was our last one, Shakespeare Unauthorized, showcasing the Thomas Pennant Barton collection, which is another major function of our work in special collections and interpretation. So built heritage at the library is always present. We look forward to having all of you on site and able to come visit us in person. And until then, we're here to answer your questions and looking forward to when we can all gather again in person.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Meg. I'm going to take over, try and share my screen. Are we seeing that?
Yes.
Great. So after that really wonderful introduction to the library as a building, as a work of architecture, I want to try and talk about how the library functions and how you can use it for research the time that we have remaining. So I want to start by talking about what really makes the BPL unique and probably very different from any other library that you've used, partly as a function of the way that it was built and the history of its operation, which really retains a lot of elements from kind of bygone days that you don't see in many libraries today. So I want to try and spend most of the time talking about how to use the BPL for research and some of the ways that I think you can get the most out of the library's collections, and definitely focus on ways for you to get help from the librarians on staff, because we're really here to ensure that you get the most out of the collections. I'm going to give a quick overview of the current services that are available, because obviously due to the COVID closure, there is much reduced access to the building and services available, but I'm going to try and cover what we can do. I want to make sure everybody gets a library card, because that's something you can do even remotely. You can do it online, and you're all eligible as students in the city of Boston to get a library card. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions for myself and for Meg. So what is it that makes the BPL unique as a library? I think there are really three factors that play into it, apart from the extraordinary building, as Meg showed us. We've got the size of the collections, the space in which those collections are housed, and then as a consequence, the way that those collections are organized in that space. So if we talk about size, how big is the BPL? As Meg mentioned, it's second only to the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library in terms of the size of its collections. So if you add together the central library and offsite storage, the central library circulating collection, and the branch and digital collections, you're looking at a total of over 23.5 million items. It's extraordinarily large. It's hard for anybody to really wrap their head around the size of it. And a collection of this size needs a consequently enormous space. So that's the second factor that's unique about the library. Here's a map that shows really all the portions of the library that we went through on Meg's tour. All the portions in gold are in the Mckim building, and all the portions in light gray are in the new Johnson building. And these are all of the publicly accessible spaces in the library. But a complete plan of the library that includes all of the non-public areas looks like this. This is a huge facility. It totals over 900,000 square feet in terms of area. And there are some real consequences for the fact that so much of the facility is off limits to the public and out of public view. And that's the organization part. All of these collections in this space have to be organized in a particular way. If we go back to that collections total figure, that line for the central library circulating, that 313,000 items, that's what a member of the public will see if they walk into the central library, go through the halls, take a look at the books on the shelves. That's the portion that they're able to see. And there's some other ways to visualize this too. If we look at just the books and periodicals in the library, in the central library, of which there are about 6.5 million, over 95% of them are in the research library, which means they're out of public view. And if we factor in all the other materials, as Meg mentioned, in addition to books and periodicals, the library has so much more. It has its rare books collections, its manuscripts and archives, maps, music scores, microfilm and microfiche collections, government documents, prints, drawings, and photographs. If you add in all of those collections, you're looking at over 98% of the central library collection that's not accessible to public view. And that has some real consequences for how you want to use the library to do your research. And I have tried to helpfully boil it down to 2 simple rules. First, you want to use the catalogs and other finding tools that we make available to you. With so much of the collection out of public view, it's really critical to use these tools to ensure that you're getting the most out of the collection. And then second, which we can't stress enough, please ask a librarian for help. It's our job to help you. It's our purpose to help you. Anytime you have a question, we'd like you to come to us, and we'd much rather have you come and ask us a question than to walk away thinking that the library doesn't have what you need or doesn't have something to offer you. So I want to talk about each of these in turn. So first of all, the catalogs and the other finding tools. One of the catalogs is very obvious. You can get to it directly from bpl.org. It's up in the top right of the screen when you visit our homepage. This is the online catalog, and it's a mostly reliable guide to everything that the library has added to the collection after about 1975 or 1980, as well as some things before then. But what about all of those earlier materials? Where are they listed and how do we find those? So for that, we have to take kind of a trip back in time. This is Bates Hall. You'll remember from Meg's tour. It looks more or less the same today. This is pretty much the view that I have of the hall from the research services desk where I work. It's a pretty nice view. So what's unique is what is down at the far end of the hall there in the south end of Bates. If you went down there in about 1900, you would have found a space that looked like this. It was filled with all of these cabinets filled with drawers. And here's another view. And every one of these drawers held hundreds and hundreds of these catalog cards. This was the card catalog for the library, and this was how people went to find out what the library held. Everything added to the library was given 3 cards, and so there were 3 ways to find something in the collection. You could look by the title, you could look by the author, or you could look by one of these subject headings. Each item would be given 1 or more of them. And those are really the most important part of the catalog, because unless you were looking for a specific book for which you knew the title, or you were looking for works by a specific author, if you wanted to find out what the library had on a given subject, the subject headings were really the way to go. They were your only option. So why are these subject headings so important? There's a couple reasons. First of all, language changes over time. And second of all, synonyms exist and people can use different words to talk about the same topic or the same concept. I want to go through a couple of examples of these. This is a book from the library's collection from 1908. It's called Famous Old Receipts, but it is not, in fact, a collection of pieces of paper that people were given for buying things. It's actually a cookbook. And back in the day, recipes were called receipts. So you'd find things in there like Mrs. Habersham's brown terrapin stew, which was helpfully labeled under fish. And then here's a couple more examples. These are both books about diseases from around the time of the influenza pandemic in 1918. The book on the left is actually about what we call tuberculosis, and the book on the right is actually about what we now call influenza or the flu. So one of the important functions of subject headings was to bring together materials on a given topic, even if the words that were used to describe them within the works themselves were not what we would be familiar with. So there would be special cards in the card catalog that would direct you, if you were looking at materials on grip, to go and see the actual subject heading, which was influenza. Now, really the best way to understand why this is significant is to look at a case where subject headings aren't in use. So I wanted to show an example from our historical Boston Globe database. This doesn't use any subject headings. It just searches the full text of articles from the historical Boston Globe. So if I was looking for information about the flu pandemic in 1918, I can start by searching for influenza. If I can remember that they also referred to it as grip, I'm going to get about 300 additional results. And if I remember that they actually sometimes spelled grip without the PE on the end, I'm going to get almost twice as many results as I started with. Another good example is the smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1872. If I don't pay attention to the fact that smallpox is often hyphenated, I'm going to actually miss out on most of the content that's available. So these are why subject headings were so important. They controlled for all these variations and inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies in language and brought things on the same topic together. And there's a reason, hopefully, that I'm belaboring this so much that I hope will become clear. But now, of course, those cards are gone and the cabinets are gone. So where is all of that today? Where is the card catalog? Well, part of it lives here, or rather on several thousand of these. This is a microfiche card. In real life, it's about the size of a postcard. And every one of the small dark rectangles on it is a miniaturized negative of a catalog card. So there are 2,500 cards on each fiche, and this is the 117th fiche for the letter P alone. So this hopefully in some way can serve as a model for you to understand how immense the catalog is and how immense the collection is. And this is all that's left of that card catalog now that it's been eliminated. But the card catalog also lives in another place. So the fiche catalog is accessible in these 3 sites in the Central Library. These are unfortunately not currently publicly accessible, but I wanted to put this up in the hope that one day you'll be able to come and take advantage of it. And please make sure anytime you come, if you're researching anything that has to do with a topic that occurred before 1980 or about which there might be significant scholarship published before 1980, please make sure to ask a librarian for help using the microfiche catalog, because that's really one of the most important ways to get access to a large part of the collection. The card catalog also lives on here, though, in the online catalog. So it's tempting to look at this and think that it looks like Google and to want to use it the same way. But I really want to emphasize that they're very, very different things. Google searches the full contents of web pages, whereas the library catalog searches only catalog records. If our library catalog worked like Google, it would search every word of every book in the library's collection, which would be nice, but unfortunately, it does not do that. Really, the card catalog and the library catalog are effectively the same thing. The catalog records that you're searching today are really just glorified versions of catalog cards from the card catalog with some extra information added in. This is really most clear when you look at the fields that you have available to search. You've got your title field, your author field, and your subject heading field. The one that's new is keyword, which searches all the words on the card the same way that keyword searching searches all of the words within a given catalog record. But what this means is that the subject headings are still there and they're still extremely important to use, even though it seems like they've been superseded. If I'm looking for historical information about public health, for example, by using the subject heading, I can find materials like Blair's 1911 work on public hygiene, even though he's using an obsolete phrase for the topic. There have been some improvements made to the subject headings in the catalog as well. They're all linked and clickable, so you can select any given heading within a catalog record to find all of the other items in the catalog that have received that same heading. They're also contractible and extendable. So between every dash is an element that you can add or remove as needed to get more or fewer results if your searches turn out to be too broad or too narrow. We don't necessarily expect you to have all of this familiarity with using subject headings or even with using the catalog. So that's one of the reasons that we're here. So I want to emphasize again that if you have any questions about using the subject headings or about using the library's catalog, please come and ask us for help. I want to emphasize one last thing before we move on, particularly for COVID times. In your lists of search results, you're going to have the option to view availability for items. Anytime you see the phrase "in library use only," those items are currently inaccessible, unfortunately. But one day, we know we'll be able to return to the building and use them as well. So I want to talk about some of the other finding tools that we make available, in particular some that I think might be of interest to the class, given your focus on the history of Boston. I want to start with the research guides. These can be accessed from the homepage under the Books and More drop-down menu in the Learning and Research column, or you can also go to guides.bpl.org. There are about 115 guides in total, but I've selected out here just a few of the ones that deal with Boston-related topics. So we've got guides to departmental reports, government history, the marathon, transit history, the public schools, LGBTQ history, all of these different topics. And these guides are all collections of resources that are put together by librarians to help you research various topics. Here's an example from the departmental reports guide. So each of these tabs collects together reports put out by each of these bodies. Now, I couldn't go without also mentioning these two very important document sets that we provide links to outside. The documents of the City of Boston set, and then the corresponding public documents of Massachusetts that function the same way on the state level. And these are both available on HathiTrust. The BPL has perhaps the greatest collection of Massachusetts and Boston newspapers in the world. So I thought I should not go without mentioning the newspaper collection and our guide to it. Unfortunately, again, most of this collection is on microfilm, which is another kind of antiquated, miniaturized analog storage format that predates computerization. And so since it requires physical access to the building for use, most of it is not currently accessible, but again, it will be one day soon, we hope. We do also still offer access to a lot of Boston and Massachusetts papers online. And I'll make sure to share a link to these slides as well in the chat so you can come back and check all of this later if you'd like to. The next kind of important finding tool are the digital repositories. As more and more material becomes part of the public domain, which means it's free of copyright restrictions, the library has the opportunity to digitize it and to make it freely available online. So there are two main repositories that are used. One is the Boston Public Library collection in the Internet Archive. This is where you'll find your books, your government documents, your manuscripts, and any other kind of texts. They'll be put here. And then the other main digital repository is Digital Commonwealth. This tends to include visual materials, so it'll have photographs, prints, drawings, posters, maps, and so forth. Both of these have really wonderful collections. I selected just a few here. Some of them are considered collections of distinction for the library, like the Anti-Slavery Collection and the Colonial and Revolutionary Boston Collection. You'll see in the lower center here the Cuneiform Tablets, which are actually the oldest items in the library's collection. These are tablets from Mesopotamia that are over 5,000 years old. And then some of the early rare and exceptional items from special collections and rare books department, like this first edition of Newton's Principia Mathematica. So there are reproductions of all of these materials and dozens of additional collections on view in Digital Commonwealth. I want to, if I have time, spend a minute talking about our online resources. So these are, your research databases, which you're probably familiar with, similar types of resources from your university library. These are accessible by subject and format, or they're also accessible in alphabetical list form. I want to call attention to the related links box in the upper right. This includes the option to search for journals by title. If you're looking for, say you have a citation for a specific journal article, this is really the best way to find out whether the BPL offers coverage of a given title. So finally, I want to talk about how to ask a librarian for help, since I've been exhorting you to do that over and over. There are 3 ways to get in touch with us. During the week, you can call us on the phone. You can send us an email, or on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 11 to 1, you can chat. I do want to emphasize that email is almost always the best option, and it's pretty easy to remember. You can email us at ask@bpl.org. When you get in touch, you're probably going to end up talking to someone from the Research Services Department. That's the department I work in. We're the BPL's largest reference department, and we cover all subjects except business. This department was formed from a bunch of prior departments that existed separately, like humanities, social sciences, and sciences. So we cover all those subjects, and we're really here to help you with your research projects, help you use the catalog, discover and access library materials, and just generally make sure that you get the most out of the library's collections. One of the services that we offer are Book a Librarian appointments, which you can find from the website under the services drop-down menu. These are appointments that you can schedule. It says 30 minutes, but we usually end up going over. They're often more like 45 minutes or an hour, or really as much time as you need. This gives you the opportunity to meet with a reference librarian one-on-one for help with your research. We have a couple of time windows during which they're available. And you can also get in touch with us to schedule those at appointments@bpl.org. So we can help you with, anything, using the catalog, using online resources, working on your research projects, finding articles, anything that you think that we might be able to help you with, we're happy to try. So at the moment, because of COVID, we have, again, limited services. So currently anything that's borrowable, which basically means any of those 313,000 items in the central circulating collection, or the 900,000 some items in the branch collections, those can all be requested and picked up at any BPL location to borrow them. We do have a print on demand service going and computer usage at the central library. All of our electronic resources are still remotely accessible. And in fact, some of the resources that used to be only accessible within the library have been made accessible remotely for the duration of COVID closure. So we've got actually more accessible remotely than we used to. And then there are those reference and research services that I mentioned, and the various ways to contact us if you have questions. This is a little hard to survey, I guess, but does anyone have a library card already? Or I guess how many folks don't yet have a library card?
Here does not have a library card.
I have a library card.
In the room,
Excellent.
we have 4 people who say they don't have library cards.
Yeah,
I don't have
Excellent.
mine.
I have a library card, but not in this state.
Okay, great. Well, as students in Massachusetts, you're all eligible to get library cards. So if you visit our website, bpl.org, under the services drop-down menu here, if you choose the eCards link there, you can also just go to bpl.org/ecard. There will be a button on the right-hand side to get or renew an eCard. If you click that and fill out the form, we will email you a library card number and a PIN number, which you'll set up. And you can use those to access all of the electronic remotely accessible resources. And you can also use those to request physical materials during this time. Closest to Suffolk, the branches are probably like the West End, maybe the North End, maybe Chinatown. So you can borrow and request materials to pick up at any BPL location as well using that eCard. So we hope that you will sign up.
Well, let me say your assignment for the class is to get, if you have a card, or to get an e-card and take a selfie of yourself in front of one of the branches showing your e-card or your library card.
Excellent. I'd like to hear that. I included this last map kind of out of a sense of hope. This is the second floor of the building. When you eventually are able to come into the building again, the way it was before COVID, this is where kind of all the action will take place as far as doing your research. So this is an annotated map of all the different service points and different portions of the collection that you can access in different parts of the second floor. And so we hope that we will see you up there one day. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Megan. We'll look forward to seeing you at the library. And
Yes.
does anyone have any questions before we call it a night or a day?
No, just thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was very informative.
This was. So thank you both. It worked well. And I will send you a link to the recording so you can, both the class and Chris and Megan. Okay. Any questions from anyone here? Okay. Well, thank you all. I will see you all on Thursday.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Good to see you. Oh, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Bob. I hope that was
Fun. That was good. That was
I
good.
hope that
Yeah.
was
Thorough and well organized. I like the visuals of both the paintings and then the card catalog and the microfiche and other things that many in the class didn't know existed.
yes.
And that was really a good historical retrospective on the building of the library. Those are great images that you have.
Thank you. It was fun to put that together. It's
Thank you.
nice. We're trying to think about the positives, and one thing you can do in a virtual
Right,
lecture
yeah.
tour is to bring in a lot of the historical images.
Yeah,
and
Yeah,
other
things you can't really do when you're on the site, but so this
Exactly.
is, yeah.
We're trying to look on the bright side.
Okay, well, thank you. Take care.
Pleasure. Take care.
You too, babe. Take care. Good to see you again, Franco.